If you're familiar with my channel at all, you've probably seen at least one of my Saints Row reviews. About a year ago, I reviewed each and every Saints Row game along with giving them all a numbered rating for the sake of comparison. The lowest scoring game was Saints Row the Third with a score of 6.75 out of 10. Not only is this score oddly specific, but I've grown to disagree with it. Before I get into why this is the case, I'd like to share the story of my very rocky relationship with Saints Row the Third. Flashback to sometime in 2011 before the release of Saints Row 3. By this point, I had already been a huge Saints Row 2 fan for years now, and I couldn't wait for the follow-up. I remember watching gameplay trailers before the release and being hyped as hell. The new cartoony art style, the crazy weapons at your disposal, it was all a 12-year-old's dream. Needless to say, I could not wait. When Saints Row the Third was released, my family was going through some financial troubles and we couldn't get the game until a few weeks after launch. One night my uncle got it from GameStop and I finally got my hands on the new Saints Row. I popped it in, made a character like this. Yes, this is an actual character I made when I was 12, and I went to town. If I remember correctly, I beat the game in about a week. Despite the adult nature, I think 12-year-old me was the prime demographic for this game. Not only is the humor very immature, but the shift in tone from Saints Row 2 wasn't as noticeable to a stupid kid like me. I didn't think about it at all, and even when I did, I didn't really mind. Regardless, even as an adolescent, I knew the quality of Saints Row 3 did not match its predecessor. I remember about a month after Saints Row 3's launch, I was just chilling in this corner store while comparing Saints Row 3 to 2 in my head, and I thought about the length of the campaign and the amount of things you can do in each game, and ultimately, I came to the conclusion that Saints Row 3 had much less content, and this was the initial reasoning as to why I still, to this day, prefer Saints Row 2 over 3. There's many more reasons now, but that was the original idea that started it all. Back in 2011, I wasn't involved in the Saints Row fanbase at all. I didn't make Saints Row content or talk on the forums. The only Saints Row fans I knew were kids at my school, almost all of which had only played 3. I remember arguing with them about how 2 was better, despite the fact that these kids had never even played Saints Row 2. The only person who seemed to share my sentiment was Angry Joe. Angry Joe, for those who don't know, is a YouTube video game reviewer that I used to watch a lot back in the day, and he spoke in great detail about how Saints Row 3 fell short from 2's expectations in his review. Anyway, I played Saints Row 3 with my cousin very regularly for over a year. If it weren't for having him as a co-op partner, I don't think my fun in Steelport would have lasted nearly as long. Despite not being as good as 2, I really enjoyed my time with Saints Row 3. Over the years, I seemed to forget that. By the time I was done playing Saints Row 3 regularly, it was almost 2013. Saints Row 4 was just a little over half a year from being released at this point, and once Saints Row 4 was released, I didn't really look back to 3. I beat 3 maybe once or twice, and that was it before Saints Row 4. Saints Row 4 to me was just more fun. The throwback missions and the return of old characters made me enjoy that game more. It felt just a tad more like what I originally enjoyed in the first place, despite a complete shift in gameplay with the superpowers. They say absence makes the heart grow fonder, and I don't think that's always true. When I first was exposed to Saints Row 3, I really enjoyed it. It still wasn't my favorite Saints Row game, but I did have lots of fun with it. Saints Row 3 was released during my 7th grade year, which was probably the hardest year of school for me. I wasn't doing well in my classes, I didn't have a lot of friends, and I dreaded going to school each day. Saints Row 3 helped a lot with that. It gave me incentive to go to school. When I got home, I could terrorize Steelport as much as I wanted to. But over the years of not playing Saints Row 3 anymore, I grew to become bitter towards it. I forgot the good memories, and I remembered the bad ones. I remember at some point just saying that the game flat out sucked. Saints Row YouTubers like Flippy brought issues with Saints Row 3 to my attention that I had never really thought about in great detail before then, such as how bland Steelport is compared to Stillwater. I didn't like this game anymore, and I didn't test it out to see if my memory served me well. This is basically how it was until last year. I wanted to be as professional as possible with my Saints Row 3 review, so I tried to keep my criticisms as constructive as possible. I mentioned that the game wasn't bad, it just wasn't what I was hoping for. The artistic changes weren't my ideal way to go, and the quality just wasn't up to par to Saints Row 2, and while I still agree with all of that, I've grown a new appreciation for Saints Row 3. The combination of beating the game again recently, watching Volition's old streams on the game, and the thoughts of the good old days have made me start to like this game a lot more than I ever did. Absence eventually did make the heart grow fonder. I have a huge soft spot for this game now, and I think despite that, even without that soft spot, I think we've all been a little bit unrealistic by comparing this game to its predecessor. I know that sounds ridiculous, that comparing a sequel to the previous game is unreasonable, but we were more than spoiled with Saints Row 2. We've all heard the comparisons between 2 and 3. The map is so much better in Saints Row 2, there's so many more Easter eggs and things to do outside the main story, etc. And while I do still believe that they underachieved in a lot of aspects in Saints Row 3, it's still up to snuff with plenty of the open world games of its era. Saints Row 2, at least in my opinion, is the best open world game of all time. To me, there's no question. And to expect a company to top that, I just kind of think is a little bit unreasonable. We got lucky with Saints Row 2. We're lucky that the game had a fraction of the features that it did in the first place. Coming off a new engine for Saints Row 3, as well as the pressure from THQ to make a profitable game in their time of need, how could they fit all those little things from Saints Row 2 in there? As much as I love the tiny details in Saints Row 2, it just isn't profitable to put them in there. They overachieved to the max, and while I love Saints Row 2 for that reason, I no longer expect them to go back to it. It just isn't realistic, especially after how Agents of Mayhem performed. They can't afford to make a product that isn't profitable anymore. Okay, so now I'm going to respond to a few points in my Saints Row 3 review that I don't necessarily agree with anymore.
However, they've turned Shaundi into a hardened bitch.
What?
My only guess for this change is to make her more independent, although they could have done that without making her all stuck up.
Although I do definitely prefer Shaundi's personality in Saints Row 2, I do understand the change. Shaundi went through growth. She was tired of being kidnapped and not being of much help often, and she changed that.
In this mission, you dress up like a pro wrestler and kill a bunch of dudes with a chainsaw during a wrestling match. Now, as a pro wrestling fan myself, it was pretty cool, and I appreciate that Volition and I have a mutual interest, but pro wrestling is about the last thing that pops into my head when I think about Saints Row.
I'd argue wrestling was always kinda there in Saints Row, at least from 2 onward. There's actual wrestling moves in Saints Row 2, as well as taunts, although that isn't the exact same because these features aren't really part of the main story, like the Murder Brawl mission was in Saints Row 3.
As previously mentioned, Steelport is the new city you inhabit in Saints Row III. It's a very industrial and dirty city, barely varied and rarely a treat to look at. The whole city looks like a washed out vintage t-shirt, boring and unattractive.
I do basically agree with everything here still, but I wish I showed off some of the more notable areas in Steelport. Some of these buildings were designed beautifully, and I'd argue that the best looking buildings in Steelport are better than the best that Stillwater has to offer. It's just a shame that there weren't more of these interesting buildings around the map. Also, the lack of enterable buildings was very disappointing.
Instead, there's barely any enterable buildings, the entire city looks the exact same, and there's not much variety in the pedestrians. The most you'll see is the occasional pedestrian holding a phone or reading a newspaper.
Again, I still agree with this, but I do wish I showed off some of the more unique animations of Steelport's pedestrians. They didn't abandon interesting pedestrians altogether, they just didn't go all out like in Saints Row 2. The pedestrian system might be the most impressive part of Saints Row 2 in my opinion. Like I said before, to expect them to continue with that insane amount of effort just might be a little bit too much to ask.
I know this is a really specific rating, but Saints Row 3 gets a 6.75 out of 10.
If Saints Row 4 gets a 7.5, Saints Row 3 should at least get a 7. I don't think the gap in quality between both games is worthy of more than half a point in difference. So there you go, I hope I didn't sound like a Volition kiss-ass the whole time. I really thought hard to find some legitimate points in defense of this game. I talked to other people about it, and I watched plenty of Volition streams to get more of a developer's perspective. Saints Row 3's biggest downfall is that it was released after Saints Row 2, and ironically, the worst thing that they could have done with Saints Row 2 was go all out like they did. It makes every game look bad in comparison.